Hello, everyone. I think a few more people might join us, but I thought we'd get started. I'm Kelly Kivlin. I'm an associate curator here at DIA, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's Artist on Artist lecture with Gabriel Kuri speaking on Jean-Luc Moulène. Sorry about that. Jean-Luc, we had a show with a few years ago in 2011 to 2012. For those of you that didn't see it, it was at Dia Beacon, and it encompassed 3 different galleries, actually. So it was really quite a survey, almost, of his work. And we have a publication, actually, outside of here, if you wanted to take a look. But before I begin, I just want to thank the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs and the Brooklyn Brewery for the beverages and their very gracious sponsorship of the series. And I'm now thrilled to introduce Gabriel. Gabriel Kuri was born in Mexico City in 1970, and he received his MA from Goldsmiths College in 1995. Most often working in sculpture, Kuri's practice incorporates common, often utilitarian materials and an investigation that departs very much from objects within our contemporary culture. To quote the artist, "All materials, no matter how raw they appear, water, stone, the wood from trees, the flow of electricity, are socially branded and coded." From works such as Stop Start Exponential Growth, a ball of socks, an inflated condom, carefully perched between a volcanic rock and boulder, to a series of store receipts that have been made anew as wall-hung wool tapestries, Kuri probes the history of commerce and exchange to specifically examine and sometimes even reconfigure how it mediates our perception and personal relationships. He has had solo exhibitions, most recently at the Aspen Art Museum, the Common Guild in Glasgow, South London Gallery, the Bergen Kunsthal in Norway, the Institute of Contemporary Art in Boston, and he's also been included in group exhibitions at the Hammer Museum in Los Angeles, the Walker Art Center in Minneapolis, and he's participated in several biennales, including the Venice Biennale in 2011 and 2003, and also the 5th Berlin Biennale in 2008. He currently lives and works in Los Angeles. Thank you again, and please join me in welcoming Gabriel Kuri.
Hello. I see many familiar faces, and that is, of course, that makes things easier, because I'm a little nervous. I have been to New York in 5 years, and it feels like an era in New York timing, so I felt like I was coming to a place that would have become a completely different place altogether. So I'm very happy to be here. Thank you very much to the DIA, Jessica, Kelly, for the invitation, and also for making me ask myself some questions that I wouldn't have otherwise. And the very obvious ones were, of course, who will I speak about? But that branched out onto some more, I would say, more interesting questions that maybe made me think of myself a little too much. But, I thought, why would I feel entitled to come here and speak about Robert Ryman or Walter de Maria or Carl Andre? Like, why would the audience want to hear me speak about that? So then I started seeing the DIA as an American institution, and I almost surprised myself. I never thought of it as such. And then I thought, okay, I'll speak about Jean-Luc Moulène. And somehow a way that I proved myself right was I was telling a lot of people I chose Jean-Luc Moulène, and most of them were saying, who's Jean-Luc Moulène? So I thought, okay, he had the most amazing survey exhibition here, curated by Yasmin Raymond, who is someone I admire very, very much. And I did not see the show, but I saw reproductions of, installation views, and it really looked splendid. And somehow I thought that it would have been the kind of exhibition that really made an amazing mark on some people, but probably also did not set Jean-Luc Moulène in the map like others would have. And I guess that takes us to another obvious point here, which is of the Frenchman in New York, and somehow the complexity of the discourse that Jean-Luc proposes with his work as something that could or could not be immediately digested in New York. So in that sense, I feel it's a very nice opportunity to bring it up again. And of course, to bring up, most importantly, the issues in Jean-Luc's work, and most hopefully discuss with you. There are many things that I admire about his work. I guess the first one is that he is an artist's artist. He is someone who works for himself. He has always worked for himself. And that is why he has this kind of cult following in France. And that is also probably why he did not have such wide exposure before this exhibition here at DIA. And I guess a measure of that same condition is, and another thing I really admire about his work is the density of thought that each of his works carry. I think of him, although I've never been to his studio, I think of him as sitting down and concentrating almost like a monk, and pouring that into an object. And this is really the density of thought that I encounter as a spectator, and I find it incredibly rewarding. I feel like I am given a lot when I go to his exhibitions. I leave with a lot of questions, with some of them being encouraging questions, some of them being simply confusing questions, but I feel that there was a lot there that suddenly was contained in this one incredibly dense thing, and I had access to it. His work, I would say that he thinks of it as discursive material. He puts it on the table, but really what he wants is to start a conversation. It's a token for discussion. He is an amazing conversationalist, how do you say? But somehow not the kind that would always want the conversation to be about art. And I would also hope that tonight we can pay homage to this and speak through his work about other things. There have been some really amazing texts written about his work by really brainy people like Briony Fair and Yves Lambois and Yasmil Raymond and Philippe Verne, and it seems like we all share the same trouble in not knowing exactly what to say. And somehow one of the certainties that I arrived to is that he's probably easiest defined for all the things that he is not. I would hope that, by the end of my presentation, you may agree on this point. His work is considered thoughtful and precise, yet not overthought, not too calculated. His exhibitions are sober and sufficient and enviably exact. Yet this is not really very easy to explain with words. And it was also a reason that I did not start this by giving you a virtual tour of the exhibition with images. I just thought it would not be really fair to the experience of walking around one of his exhibitions that really strike for their precision. And this precision is, of course, complicated to explain. But I would rather do it with words than vicariously with JPEGs. His work doesn't really, in my view, come from what's called, commonly lyricism or talent when it comes to form. I don't think he's one of those that just has the formal talent and just churns out beautiful objects and can make one object unfold onto another, and then everything fitting into a puzzle in that way. I sense that his works don't come easily, and there's a certain visual density about them that radiates that density of thought, and this doesn't, it never really comes without a necessary dose of struggle. His images, shapes, and concepts make a comfort zone into a zone of conflict. And as I said earlier, it is really a frontal invitation to debate. And always sitting in front of you really to spark conversation. Jean-Luc has always said how he prefers the notion of protocol over the notion of system. When talking about his modus, systems, in his own words, constrain the elements, and protocol is content with transformation, which is open-ended. And while there is an enviable rigor in his research, as we will see in the images, there's clearly no desire to really delve into a grand narrative. He really prefers the unfinished statement. The way I structure my presentation was something I allowed myself, and then I got his permission, and it is basically cutting into one of his works called La Vigie, the first image of which we see on the screen. La Vigie is a 7-year period by which he photographed a plant that's growing from the crack in a pavement in a very urban dwelling in Paris, where just outside of where he lives. And he spent 7 years photographing the growth and resurgence, and then death, and then rebirth, and etc. Well, never death, but really all the different incidents and the tenacity of the life of this plant. And the context around it. And there are 2 rows of pictures that were in the exhibition, and I thought that by showing only one of the rows of pictures that deals strictly with, let's say, the close-up of the life of this plant, and then intersected with images of other works, I would somehow do what he intended with the other row of pictures that zoom out to other aspects of the context of Paris. And with each one of these images, where I stop, I made some notes, some questions, and also some quotes. I would hope that you also take a moment to stop and maybe think, and we can have a little chat afterwards. Ask me later. Okay. Paulownia Tomentosa is an extremely fast-growing deciduous tree native to central and western China. It is a persistent, exotic, invasive in other countries that can grow up to 25 meters tall. It is not precious about soil type. It is tolerant of pollution and can survive wildfire because the roots can regenerate new, very fast-growing stems. For this reason, it functions ecologically as a pioneer plant. It breaks through into unclaimed land. However, it cannot survive nor thrive in the shade of other trees. Moonface, Paris, May 2014, polished concrete and blue blanket, 7 by 10 by 12 inches. Jean-Luc Moulène is French, and he's an old soul. He can be found sitting with serenity behind a cloud of cigarette smoke. and is always up for engaging conversation with his gentle and raspy voice. He has degrees in literature and philosophy from La Sorbonne in Paris, and a very vast knowledge of art history. He has held many different jobs and can see circumstance from many different eyes and many different lenses. He may be comfortable in his cloud of cigarette smoke, but contrary to the other more frequent cliché about the French, his artwork is never an illustration of theory. He works from experience. And here I explain this cliché, which I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with, and it comes most often as a form of disappointment when you try to look at some less fortunate French artist's work and you realize he or she has read a lot of books and a lot of the same kind of philosophy books, and then the work is somehow a reference to these books. And that, as I said, is a form of disappointment. His images and objects have a gravitas that pulls towards them and does not deflect the attention or issue towards the safety zone of bibliographical reference. His work is one of constant interrogation and never one that settles in a zone of cool comfort, other than to make of it a zone of new conflict. Although he constantly establishes typologies, his is not a drive to classify and create constraining systems, as I said earlier, that he can seemingly control. Arthur, Paris 2010, human skull, concrete 8 by 8 by 8 by 10 inches. Rocks are formed in 4 main ways and are classified accordingly. Igneous rocks form quickly from a molten material called magma as it moves and cools through a process known as fractional crystallization. Sedimentary rocks result from sediments deposited out of water or the air. As the sediments are buried, they get compacted as more and more material is deposited on top. Eventually, the sediments will become so dense that they will form a rock. This slow process is known as lithification. Metamorphic rocks result from the alteration of other rocks through temperature and pressure-induced changes in the minerals. Metamorphic rocks may have once existed as igneous or sedimentary rocks and been subjected to varying degrees of pressure and heat within the Earth's crust. The processes involved will change the composition and fabric of the rock, and their original nature is often hard to distinguish. The artist can be defined as a practitioner in society with a special privilege to take time off, in order to take time to give concrete form to mental image. Through a process combining fractional crystallization, lithification, and metamorphosis, the artist presses to condense all those hours invested in isolation or drifting into a rock, with which he or she expects to pay society back. This rock, the fourth in this classification, is both a receptacle of intensive thinking and a dispenser of intensive thanking. Measure, New York, 3rd February 2010, 16 by 14 inches. After being naturally drawn to this image, that's also on the cover of the DIA catalog, I noticed the word New York in the caption, and then the title, Measure. Like in practically all cases, this work has the city where it was made noted in the caption. And then looking into coming to do a lecture in this city, I began to interpret this image as an oblique comment on pragmatism. Pragmatists consider thought an instrument or tool for prediction, problem solving, and action based on practical rather than abstract considerations. Pragmatism is an approach that assesses the truth of meaning of theories or beliefs in terms of the success of their practical application. Pragmatic approach welcomes shortcuts and co-optation and can be said to set the basis for commodification and quantification of everything. Now, if we were allowed to go further into reading signs that are hopefully there in the image, could one say that the author is resisting pragmatism by using the metric system on a coin minted with imperial measures? Or by showing his personal and used ruler and not simply the concept of the metric? Or maybe by slipping some slack or some imperfection into the image? (0408 1996) Nu Asi, 110 by 140 centimeters. Pragmatism. Moulène resists pragmatism by idealism, that is, by attempting to make something out of nothing. His work resists pragmatism by being concrete, as a coming together and curing inwardly, rather than displaying an opening motion towards any and all possible negotiations. Moulène resists pragmatism by realism, not by the acceptance of conditions, whereas physical or social, but by the assumption that it is reality. It is reality which includes that which is not observable nor comprehensible, that will spell out the key. He resists pragmatism by abstraction, and I will be talking a little bit about this later. (37) Pantanoise, Les Objets de Grève, La Pantanoise, 1999, 2000, 7 by 5 inches. Object de Grève doesn't have a very satisfying translation into English. The most direct is strike object, or stoppage object, or walkout object. Object de Grève, or strike objects, is an extendable inventory of images or products, and later some of the objects themselves, fabricated in assembly lines during a strike. All of these have either an effacement on the company logo, an added phrase on the packaging impeding the function or finality of the product, or else some crucial information missing. It does not take too much thought to see that these objects are caught up in a circular motion between production and stoppage, and of their definition and denial. They are a detour rather than a complete stop, but in their anomalous nature, these cipher a probably more pernicious alteration to the productive output than the simple suspension of work. These objects embody the fact that the workers are in control, at least physically speaking, of the means of production, and can force them in an appeal to improve their conditions. Mouléne's view of these products is not a sociological investigation, but rather an addition of principles. As he turns them into his own artistic product, by making a photograph or showing the actual object, he transports the paradox of their exceptional fabrication into the paradox of his own praxis in their representation. Now, observing how this stoppage in production can be activated as production, it threw light on 2 points that I have lately been asking myself in my own practice. And these are whether to, in order to legitimately make art, I can claim consumption as production, and also to think that maintenance can be production. And by this I mean, instead of production being an addition, could production be brought forward in an act of recycling, replacing, or keeping alive? Blue Galloises Bleu of June 2000. A box with over 400 packages of Blue Gauloise cigarettes, also produced during a strike. Here we have an object distilled from the meditation on its very notion of the social and economic contract that regulates its production. An object effaced from its iconic branding and the itemization of its content, and left with no other feature than its color blue. Now, is this product a non-product? Is this object a non-object? Or, in its radical embodiment of an idea, could it be thought as the secret origin of abstraction? Rather than celebrating the branding in reverse, or celebrating the color blue in reverse, the twice blue, Bleu Gauloise, work as some sort of double negative. And rather than being the cipher in negative of a stoppage, they become the affirmation of the possibility to abstract the purpose or fruit of labor. And is this stoppage of production also a stoppage or suspension of meaning? In one of the essays I read about this work, the author elegantly says, these objects produced against the backdrop of inactivity which remains visible in a work paradoxically produced by the activation of a principle of deactivation, the intention being that viewers should be able to make the work their own and not find themselves excluded from it. And what do I say? I will try to explain all of this to a factory worker, just as I could try to explain to the same factory worker that according to other contemporary theoreticians, we are living in a post-industrial society. Spore 1, 2008, Mushroom Spores on Paper. This is where I come to one of the main points that I want to formulate. And as I was telling Kelly earlier, if I feel that I can put across 3 or 4 points, that really should feel enough so that we can get conversation going. And this point here is the creation of false problems. Again, I am defining Jean-Luc Moulène for what he isn't. Jean-Luc is an artist that really knows where to stop or to take a sharp turn. A lot of his systems or protocols and a lot of aspects about his modus would somehow lead him into very easy temptations of following a certain series and somehow just losing sight of the real, of the crux of the problem. But then again, I'm defining him for what he isn't. And by a false problem, I mean, again, with a sense of deception. When I look at an artwork and I see that the artist discovered something and then exploited it really beyond its relevance. And it started becoming some sort of tick. And this could have happened to Jean-Luc with the products of Palestine, or with the object de grève, or with the portraits of sex workers, in that he, after completing a series of them, he could have thought, after the ones in Amsterdam, why don't I go and photograph prostitutes somewhere else? Or if I photographed products in Palestine, why don't I now go to another zone of conflict and make photographs there? He really knows, as I said, where to take a sharp turn, or where to stop, and avoid the creation of a false problem. And avoid making futility the aesthetics of the defeated purpose. Lenaud Coulon, Paris 2007, Felt and Collage on Paper. Minimalism or conceptualism somehow adhere to Calvinism in their urge to strip down ritual to its least reliant on form, and form to its most fundamental. Calvinistic stripping down is a road led by enlightened reason to synthetic clarity, elegantly stopping somewhere comfortably close to the abyss of blankness. Stripping down may, however, also be a road that, in removing visible layers, starts exposing opacity and therefore reveals depth. Chef, Paris, 11th of April 1998, 76 by 91 centimeters. For a long time, Jean-Luc's exposed output was only photographic. He worked with the camera throughout the 80s and did not exhibit, 90s, and did not really exhibit objects until the exhibition at the Arsenale in Venice in 2003. And again, in order to try and define his photography to myself, I had to somehow define it for what it isn't, or to define it in the space that it occupies between photography and something else. And that's somehow when I started to explain to myself why I saw connections between him and other photographers, or other artists, better said, that work with the camera. And it is that the clues have always been sculptural. Here I think of the work of Gabriel Orozco or Michel François or Christopher Williams, who each one in their own right and to a greater or lesser degree are sculptors. In very different ways, of course. I see connections with Gabriel Orozco's photographs as pieces of evidence. Michel François' celebration of surprise and the beauty of experience, although in the case of Michel François, there's almost, in their generosity, there's almost a hedonistic gesture. And in the case of Christopher Williams, whose photographs have this crystal clarity that makes them so visible that they become mysterious or unsolvable, somehow I pair that to Jean-Luc's opacity. And there's also something about exhibiting his photographs that is sculptural. I will talk a little bit about his exhibitions later, but there is something about the specificity of their spatial distribution that I can only interpret as sculptural and not really following the protocol, or much closer to the conventions of photographic display. Huile d'olive, produit de Palestine, 2007, 19 by 15 inches. In the corpus of his photographic work, we see pictures that have the indexical nature of photoconceptualism, yet not the personal detachment. His indexes do not have the urge to make authorship or impersonal involvement redundant. Jean-Luc's work explores mechanisms of production and distribution. He conceives of both production and distribution as acts of resistance, and resistance as a vindication of humanism. We saw earlier that the strike objects come from a symbolic suspension or stoppage of production. In production, this image is part of a corpus called Products from Palestine, and they are, as the title indicates, products made under exceptional conditions of fabrication and trade, and invisible beyond their narrow and conflicted border. Rich, Le Havre, January 2010. Plastic bottle reduced to heat, artificial diamond, and water of 12 by 2 by 2 inches. And here, in lack of something that to add that I would feel was like justifying my own practice, as this is one of the works that I thought I could have just as well made myself, I thought of accompanying this image with a quote from one of his interviews about his objects being called post-photographic. And I quote, "I conceive them all like objects after a world of photographs. Therefore, they are not objects in the sense of statuary or sculpture. They are objects linked to the questions of production, representation, post-photography, objectivation. As such, photography continues to be the research tool for these objects, even if at the end I don't propose a print." Roxanne Amsterdam, 17th of March 2004, from the series Les Filles d'Amsterdam of 2005. Here I wanted to be loyal to or truthful to the way I selected all the images. I felt, of course, drawn to this image and suddenly short for words. Just like I wouldn't want to be the one explaining to the factory workers how Jean-Luc has transported their strike objects into being an artistic product. I wouldn't want to be the one explaining to Roxana all the concepts that spring to mind, like body art and tools and means of production and whatnot. This is an image of the most recent exhibition I saw of Jean-Luc, and it is really striking in his exhibitions how precise the layout is. And what I mean by precise is not a harmonious balance. There is a precision which is of a different kind. He thinks of his exhibitions as, he says he likes to think of his exhibitions as group shows. And I think that's probably where I find what I mean by precision. There is he doesn't really follow the charm of exception, let's say, of each one of the constituents of the exhibitions. Yet there is something that somehow makes them feel specific unspecific, purposeful, yet it's something, as I said, is complicated to explain with a journey through the exhibition in photographs. Here I just wanted to show, the axis, the diagonal axis, the choice of the pictures, the precision that he has in the choice of plinths and tables, and he really has the right pitch when it comes to layouts and displays. And it's very clear that he really rejects the notion of the artist as someone that can be defined by stylistic continuity. Cinq concentrés concentriques, Paris, April 2007, Rubber and Plastic. Explicitly political art is one that points a finger at the second person, while in reality pointing it to the subject in the mirror. I admire this sculpture for its many directions, for being both explosion and vortex. The point of convergence of these fingers is the very point of connection, conflict, and also concealment. Whereas Marcel Duchamp's ready-made was revolutionary in its velocity, speeding up the act of making art to an instant, consummated by the pointing finger, this work, Cinq concentrés concentriques, makes of pointing its modus and also its subject, structure, means, and ends. And what are these fingers pointing at? They are pointing at pointing. Mathematically speaking, they are a sort of exponential self-reference. In its directionality, this work seems to embody the centripetal quality that unifies Moulene's production beyond its diversity of matter and mediums. It embodies a matrix of lines that point inwards. And rather than fast, this pointing is simply latent. It is not exactly resulting from action nor inaction, but completely loaded with potential. Boîte à jus, Paris, summer 2005. Wood, primer, juice of piss and shit and wax, 12 by 23 by 15 inches. Juice box. Modernist shape. This is a scale model of a wider social circumstance. I read somewhere that in addition to trade and democracy, when it came to technique, modernity could be defined as a time with tremendous leaps in two areas of society. One, the technologies for weaponry, and the other, the management of bodily fluids. Parallel to the rapid advancement in the development of sophisticated tools to destroy with precision and control destruction at a long range, the last century saw a great increase in the habits, infrastructures, policies, and devices for concealing spit, urine, and shit that had been, up to then, channeled through open sewages or simply accepted as part of public life. Crystal Sex, Paris, 2006. Civic Romes and Brads, 17 by 23 by 19 inches. As Bryony Fair said in one of her essays in the DIA catalog, he has called his objects unspecific in an obvious challenge to Donald Judd's specific objects. Just like Judd found his specificity in the slippage between object and image, these are unspecific in their unstable stance between image and thing, yet only stable at specificity of intent. And I quote Moulène again in conversation with Briony Fair. Yes, the product became my commonplace. It is a product in the sense of content, washing up liquid, etc., in the sense of a result of the work and of its economy, and that of the operation of reproduction. It sums up form and ground, use and value. The product, as regards its technical determination, is the enigma of the modern condition. When Judd defines the specific object, neither painting nor sculpture, we are in the realm of art. With his minus objects, Pistoletto is referring to the set of possibilities. The minus object is an object that, in being made, has been withdrawn from the ensemble of possibles. People have spoken of the image object. I speak of the image and object, of photograph and product, both transformed. What interests me are these functions of transformation. What then is an ordinary object? What orders organize it, construct and transform it? In concrete terms, the question comes down to, can one produce any nondescript, quelconque in French, object with exactitude? Jean-Luc once told me that he made special emphasis in the genitals of the pictures of the sex workers being right at the dead center of his portraits. And I think he took this idea further with his work that makes an unelegant sculpture out of photographic paper and does not shy away from focusing directly on the photographic punctum. Untitled of 2011, 2 glass bottles, bone and concrete, each one roughly 15 by 3 by 3 inches. Petta Physics. French writer Alfred Jarry said, "Petta Physics will be above all the science of the particular. It will describe a universe which can be, and perhaps should be, envisioned in the place of the traditional universe. Since the laws that are supposed to have been discovered in the traditional universe are also correlations of exceptions, albeit more frequent ones." To this, and with regards to the implications of labor in pataphysics, Daumal added, just as pataphysics as knowledge is the reverse of physics, the exact mirror opposite of physics, so pataphysics as the mode of activity in the sphere of production probably reacts very strongly against the attempted rationalization of labor. Jean-Luc works diligently for his objects to have the curved simplicity and clumsy modesty of a potato. His shapes are proudly patatoid. And by practicing pataphysics with them, a science of the particular, he describes a universe of patatoid forms. And I like that, although Jean-Luc is clearly interested in science, his work does not fall for the temptation to produce art as science. But in terms of its epistemological sufficiency, his pataphysics are not a science of the absurd. They are serious pataphysics. Four Birdies, Marseille, July 2012, blue glass and iron, 16 by 13 inches. Otherness. Luxury, arts, perverse sexual activity, i.e. deflected from genital finality. All of these represent activities which, at least in primitive circumstances, have no end beyond themselves. In each case, the accent is placed on a loss, that must be as great as possible in order for the activity to take on its true meaning. This is how Georges Bataille refers to non-productive expenditures. Tupi, 2015, cement, 59 by 30 by 16 inches. This is a rare work that subtracts. Jean-Luc is clearly someone that works in a circular motion. Thinking and making become somehow the same verb. And he has also stated that he believes destruction is also the beginning of the creative act. However, we don't see much subtraction or breaking in his conception of destruction. This is why I singled out this work. Here we see the trace of an automatic tool taking away material, which is then somehow occupied by the nestling of the neck of that goose. A Grand Monochrome jaune Kodak, Paris, summer 1988. Civic Rome mounted on aluminum of 39 by 31 by 1 inches. Sometimes the story behind the work is best told by its title, when it is a mere reference to the object. Jaune Kodak, yellow Kodak, or Kodak yellow. And I guess not much else has to be explained of his constant assessment of modes of production and circulation. September 2010, Concentré de tomates, Documents Produits de Palestine, 2002. Civic Rome on die sec of 19 by 15 inches. And here we go on to the Palestinian products. The creation of a product, an artistic product. The distance that separates the viewer from these objects is not the perpetual deferral of desire, as in the never-attained fulfillment of desire that drives the consumerist world and is fueled by advertising, but rather the fact that these are products from the occupied territories of the West Bank and Gaza Strip, which don't circulate as part of the world market due to imposed sanctions. And where is their space? And what about their distribution? Manuel Joseph, Paris, 4th July 2006, of 2008. Civic Rome mounted on aluminum of 127 by 85 centimeters. Jean-Luc Moulène has worked closely with his fellow French poet Manuel Joseph. Manuel Joseph has written texts that feature in Jean-Luc's books and other printed matter. Here we see him with half of his body soaked, and it's not really clear why. I actually had to translate. I was telling Kelly earlier. I had to translate one of Manuel Joseph's texts, and it nearly made me ill. It was very difficult and painful. And now it made me refer to Nietzsche's idea about philosophy, and by extension, poetry, how it could not be understood without understanding the overall health of the person who philosophizes, and that philosophy may not be more than the product of a person trying to interpret his or her own body, just an expression of symptoms from that body. I suppose without really being able to put reason above the strict demands of a possibly ill physique. Francis, Parfum de Solidarité, 1999-2000 of 2015. Digital print on Fuji crystal paper under Diasec of 18 by 14 inches. Perfume of solidarity. Don't touch my job. Whose job? Solidarity with what or who? Solidarity with the right to differ. Can the right to differ be only an ethics? Or can it sum up to become an aesthetics? The Pleasure Dome, scale model, Antwerp, November 2013. Bricks, cement, foam, and steel, of 19 by 39 by 39 inches. I have been reading a very good book about boredom by a fellow Mexican writer named Luigi Amara. And in it he speaks of ennui, reflection, introspection, philosophy, and tedium. He mentions the Tower of Michel de Montaigne, the French philosopher of the Renaissance, as a space that was crucial in shaping Montaigne's thought. And the mathematician and also philosopher Blaise Pascal, always in the enclosure of his chamber. Here we see the dome of Moulène. He titled it the Pleasure Dome. I honestly don't know why. What really strikes me is that, just like a cloud, it is a traveling cover, a transportable mental enclosure. If art as philosophy cannot completely yield to the fact that the artist is, like a traveling salesperson, condemned to trot the world incessantly just in order to deserve to be called an artist, this indispensable object in which to retrieve in retrospection may come as a comment to that. Moulène lives in Paris, very near the Ministry for the Economy, Industry and Employment. It was there that he photographed the Paulownia Tomentosa regularly for 7 years, amongst the constant deployment and collapsing of barricades and chains, and exposed equally to the incidents of the climate and the social incidents. I don't know how clear the long duration of 7 years for this project, whether it was set from the start. But I do know that the real challenge of this endurance test is not merely to endure, not to remain sane, but not to lose sight of the tree. And more importantly, to always be able to tell the forest from the tree. Can we have the lights on now, please?
coming back. Am I on? Thank you, Gabriel. I think what's interesting about the 7 years for me is this idea of, isn't there like a 7 years of change, this regeneration, or that after 7 years there's always this constant renewal of self. And for me, I think I mark that with Jean-Luc's tenacity of always embracing change and not having, as you said, embracing this rejection of continuity in practice. And through your presentation, I really got a sense of that even further. So I thank you. And for those that didn't see the exhibition, actually, it was a really wonderful walkthrough of his practice and quite comprehensive. So it's a very ambitious undertaking, and I thank you. So for those that have questions, I'm happy to walk around and gather your thoughts. I know it always takes a while for people to... Yes? You can speak up too if you like.
Thank you so much for your talk, which I enjoyed immensely. I didn't really know Jean-Luc's work very well before. But I actually wanted to ask you if you could talk a bit more about Roxanne and how maybe in terms of production and distribution, I mean, that is like a bit of a slightly, I mean, I want to hear your opinion about it and maybe talk about how it and if it is in dialogue with your practice.
Well, my practice as in do I pay for sex? I don't think I have a moral impediment of talking about this image, but I somehow didn't feel like I had anything to say about it. I mean, it is what it is, and I think with one image you're probably able to tell what the whole series would be about. Here we have a frontal portrait of a sex worker with legs spread open, the genitals right in the center. There's a matter of factualness there that I think speaks for itself. And I somehow feel that all of these other notions that are clear in all of Jean-Luc's work that have to do with production, means of production, the control of means of production, etc. I feel like I wouldn't want to be the one to speak about them as looking at this image. That's why I kind of deflected the question towards you. So unless you have something to say for yourself, I don't have for myself. Mm-hmm. Perhaps there is some sort of moral barrier, I guess, because it's just easier to talk about the human condition using an object between you and whoever's exploited, or you or whoever is in control of the means of production. And I think that is also why these works are compelling, because they also occupy that space of that discursive space between the spectator and the producer of the artwork.
Maybe it's just like taking a picture of one of his factory workers with their tool. That's what I picked up on when we want to talk about. And that's just her smiling, saying, "Hey, this is what I do." I don't think there was any moral judgment to be had on any of our parts.
I don't think they're judgmental at all. No, I mean there's a frontality about them that I think speaks for itself. And I think it must be pretty hard to make portraits of sex workers without being, sensationalist or moralistic or recur to the narrative or try to see the human side about it. I mean, what could be more patronizing than that? There's something else there, I think.
I think that maybe it's because he really takes the concept of the ready-made, and in all his work of art is present. So actually, the girl Roxana is not really a prostitute, but is just something considered like an object that it has been taken out from, you know, the real environment and put it in a piece of art. Even, for example, the piece of the Paulownia of the plant, that plant lose its function because, you know, a plant is just a plant, but in his picture that he photographed the plants for 7 years, the plant is like something that is watching what is happening. So I think that is, you know, the main reason is just to take off something from the reality and put in a different concept that is become a work of art. So it's really not an images that can be ashamed. The Roxana, you know? I don't know if it's clear.
In terms of the Roxana image, I thought about Leo Steinberg's essay on sexuality in Christ, which was Leo Steinberg's essay on sexuality in Christ, because the center of the vagina is very similar to this kind of Middle Ages investigation he did on the centering of Christ's penis. And I don't know that much about Jean-Luc, but is this something that you think might be a coincidence, or do you think Jean-Luc is someone who might be aware of this essay? I mean, also just because of like the Mary Magdalene reference, and then potentially the, you know, putting the female.
That's a good question, and honestly, I don't know. I have not talked to him about that, about the references somehow, literary references in that work. I mean, the one comment I do remember about it is that he wanted the, you know, genitals to be right in the dead center of the picture, and not like a, I guess, like a leaning pose in which there was a little suggestion or.
Which is what Steinberg actually argues, is that
okay.
like at a certain point they're putting Christ's penis right in the center of the picture, literally, to show the humanity and also their own artistic sexuality. But
I think again there's that centripetal force that I mentioned when I talked about the piece of the fingers, and there's this force that always draws towards the center, like his pieces cure like that. And there is a strong sense of center, I think, in the objects, in the pictures, but also in the line that runs through them, because one cannot speak of a stylistic line. It's difficult to talk about him because of that. You know, I mean, where do you start? There's no style. There's several media. You know, there's photography and sculpture, and also one thing I didn't mention, but he also in most of distribution, he places the exhibition also always in question, and often in his exhibitions there's like something that's handed out. So images are also distributed in that way, like you take home the image, and that I think activates also another channel of distribution, which is really important.
Anybody else?
Maybe the only thing, or maybe the only thing that's necessary for production is a space for thinking. So maybe, for example, a person's genitals provide the space for thinking. For example, like you were saying, like with those fingers that kind of provide some sort of space, you know, that's not necessarily self-reflexive, but reflexive.
So you said that the only thing that's necessary for production is a space.
No, necessary for production is thinking.
Uh-huh.
A thought, and hopefully multiplicity of thought.
I would have to agree with that, yes.
So it seems like with each object, it's a non-object, it's a non-image,
Mm-hmm.
but it's something that is simply, he simply seems to want a space to think.
And do you sense that there's a motion towards that space or from that space?
Sorry?
Do you sense that there's a motion towards that space or from that space? Because my impression is that it's always, you know, like that density that I was talking about in the beginning, and then that density that radiates out towards the spectator.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't necessarily say that's emotional. I'd say it's probably non-emotional.
No, motion, I said. Not emotion, but motion, yeah.
You said something about the tension between making and destroying in his work. And I might be remembering incorrectly, but I think that in the photograph of Roxanne and in that sculptural piece, you're not only seeing her genitals, you're actually seeing her anus also. So I think that there's also something in her pose, the way she's kind of slumped over. I can sense it in my body, and it feels almost like defecating. So I think that there's that tension that you're talking about in terms of making and destroying is represented in those photographs as well.
Mm-hmm. And what about that piece that's varnished with piss and shit? Yeah. That's something I didn't mention, but I also thought when the first time I saw it, I thought it looked like one of these shapes that is used a lot these days, that it's kind of trendy to quote modernism and to make objects with funny angles as a quote. And it's actually also, it feels to me like it's the inside of a box, a juice box, which is a refuse item. And then it's varnished with shit and piss. And then I thought of that quote of modernity as being in an era where there was a huge leap in the management of bodily fluids. How they are more and more concealed with and dealt with as if they didn't exist. That's, I guess, also why some of the early modern cities find it harder to conceal piss. I mean, the first things I heard about the Paris metro when I was living in Mexico was that they smelled of piss. And I guess that's probably why. They were early in that, and it's only now that they're trying to cover that up.
Anyone else? I wanted to say too about Roxanne. I know it's part of a series, but what's interesting to me about that position is also a position many women take in birth. And I think that for me, that photo, there's a sense of agency, but also empowerment as well, not just in her gaze, but in that position. So, anyone else? Thank you, Gabriel.
Thank you all very much.